UNL Extension says the recent snowstorm in northwest Nebraska killed more than 2,200 cattle. Across the border, Sylvia Kristen, the executive director of the South Dakota Stock Growers Association, told the Rapid City Council the rain and snow directly hit 16 South Dakota counties. Kristen says while there isn't a specific count of dead cattle, she believes the South Dakota Governor's Office approximation of 30,000 dead livestock could be half the actual total. Kristen says the direct impact from losses might reach $500 million. She estimates the indirect cost could tally nearly $1.7 billion. As we mentioned in our previous episode, these affected farmers and ranchers currently have little help from the federal government with the absence of a livestock indemnity program. UNL Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben joined us Wednesday to discuss the details of that program and if producers can anticipate seeing it again with the eventual passing of a new farm bill.
Well, we expect the Livestock Indemnity Program to help us out with these tremendous cattle losses due to the blizzard, but we can back up and look at that program. It helps producers cover death losses in the herd when we have death losses above normal, such as we have with this event. It's part of disaster assistance that we've historically seen passed in Congress year after year. In the '08 Farm Bill, it was permanently authorized as part of a portfolio of disaster assistance programs. So it's there to help producers when we have these losses occur. Unfortunately, the '08 bill only authorized it through 11, and all of those disaster programs then essentially fell out of authority. They were reauthorized with the extension of the Farm Bill here at the beginning of 2013. They've now technically expired again. All this awaits final completion on a Farm Bill before we can finally get back to offering assistance in those programs.
What was the coverage in the '08 Farm Program? How did it work?
Essentially, producers could file for assistance for a percentage of the market value of the animals that they lost due to these disaster events. So you have to have good records of inventories, inventories lost, death losses, records of the weather event, in this case the blizzard event, or last summer some of the death losses in the feedlot that might have occurred due to the heat and humidity conditions. You have to have good records of those things that have happened and then be prepared to apply for assistance at the Farm Service Agency office.
Now, there was an aspect of this that kind of came into play last year when the drought hit and forages were in such short supply, right?
Part of the disaster portfolio wasn't just the Livestock Indemnity Program for death losses, but the Livestock Forage Disaster Program for essentially losses of grazing capacity and forage quantity. That was a disaster assistance program that triggered automatically based on what level of drought a producer was facing. Certainly we would have had great need for that assistance in 2012, and yet because of the lack of authority and the lack of funding, it's not yet available. We eventually expect a Farm Bill to get done that will retroactively authorize and fund that assistance backing up through 2012. Now, so producers might eventually be applying for forage loss assistance from what losses they had back in 2012. They should be applying for death loss assistance here for these losses in 2013. Eventually, we expect that assistance to be on the way to producers.
But the key part is that the assistance would not be immediate, right? Those checks would not be cut.
Checks
next day.
Checks don't happen the next day, but just as soon as we have a Farm Bill and funding for that portion, you can envision the USDA rolling out a program and offering assistance. It's really contingent upon getting this Farm Bill to completion.
We know now that the Farm Bill, the Senate and House are scheduled to meet next Wednesday afternoon. When they say it's going to committee, just explain to me what that means.
Well, recall the years now of progress and failed progress on this bill. Watching it in 11, watching it in 12, watching it in 13. The Senate voted for a Farm Bill to go to committee back in June. The House tried to vote on a full Farm Bill in June and failed, and they ended up voting on a farm-only portion in July. And then they came back in September and passed a nutrition title bill in September. The House has put the farm-only bill and the nutrition bill back together for purposes of negotiation with the Senate, and thus we proceed to a conference committee. The conference committee reviews essentially differences between House and Senate legislation in an attempt to produce a compromise version. That would come back to both the House and the Senate for a final up or down vote.
Since you become sort of a Farm Bill deadline expert
Yes,
here.
yeah.
The permanent legislation that it now reverts back to, some groups are saying that they don't want that taken out because then in the future, if one were to expire, you could still have something to fall back on.
Correct.
Explain to me how the permanent legislation works.
Well, permanent legislation has been the hammer that forces a real conversation every few years on a farm bill. We talk about permanent legislation, we refer to 1949. There's language from 38 and there's language from 49 that is officially on the books, only to be superseded by modern day farm bills, but never technically repealed, just superseded. When a modern farm bill expires, that old language is still on the books. One proposal that has showed up in the House version would be essentially updating that permanent title to the 2013 version of the legislation. So instead of the 49 legislation being the last one that doesn't expire, it would be the 13 bill that doesn't expire. Well, that makes some sense. It's more efficient program, more feasible, more palatable, etc. But if we have a 13 bill that doesn't expire, then come 2018, it's time to debate this thing again. There's not the same impetus to get the debate done in 18 if you revert to 13 than there is if you're in 18 and you might revert to 1949. It's a push to actually keep the oldest language on the books just because it's a hammer.
Again, the Farm Bill is scheduled for conference meeting Wednesday afternoon. Regarding further assistance to farmers and ranchers in South Dakota, the USDA said this week it's offering special sign-up through the NRCS Environmental Quality Incentives Program. That sign-up runs through November 15th and will help producers dispose of livestock carcasses, replace destroyed fencing, and rebuild shelter belts and other conservation practices destroyed by the storm.